Dave Talks Comics, Episode 92, Baltimore Comic-Con 2015, Part 3. Welcome to Dave Talks Comics, a program on the subjects of comic books and cartoons. I talk about comic books I have read and cartoons I have watched. But on this episode, I will be talking about Day 3 of the Baltimore Comic-Con. The Baltimore Comic-Con 2015 is over and done with. But here's my report for Day 3. I got up and got out the door by about 8 o'clock this morning. I got to Baltimore by 9. What I like to do on the Sundays of Baltimore Comic-Con, when I do go on Sunday, because last year I only went on Saturday, is I like to go to the farmers market at Baltimore. It's huge. It's bigger than any other farmers market that I've ever been to, and you can get breakfast there. They've got all kinds of people preparing food there, and of course the other kinds of stuff you find at farmers markets. You know, all kinds of produce, fresh meat, and yeah, I mean it's huge. It's huge. So I went there. I got some samosas, something like that, for breakfast. I had 3 of them. They weren't real big, and they didn't completely fill me up. One was vegetarian, one was pork, and one was chicken. And they were all pretty good. I can't remember the name of the stand where I got them from, though. But I think it was $2.75 a piece, or if you got 3, it was $7.50. And then I walked around while I was eating them, and spotted some other things. I was thinking about going to get some, because in the past there's a stand that sells Thai food, and so I was thinking about getting some mango and sticky rice, which I've had before. But there was kind of a line, and then I wasn't sure if they had any left, and so I decided to get something else. So I walked around. I wound up at this bakery stall, and I got 2 pastries there. I got a sticky bun, and which I guess had walnuts or something like that on it, and I got something that looked like a scone, or kind of like a popover, with raisins, and of course it was made with sugar, and probably cinnamon, and nutmeg, or something like that, and I ate half of each of those before I went to the con. I also got a loaf of bread of honey grain bread, something like that. And I dropped that off in my car before I went to the con. I parked in the same place that I parked on Saturday, which was about equidistant from the farmers market and the convention center. The farmers market is not right next to the convention center. It's a bit of a walk. It's probably a good mile walk from the convention center. But I think it's worth it, and I've enjoyed it. I think I've gone there. I think I went there in 2010, 2011, 2012. Of course, 2013 I didn't go to the Baltimore Comic-Con. In 2014 I didn't go on Sunday. But I had been up there for the farmers market, just not on the day of the Baltimore Comic-Con last year, I believe. Maybe even earlier this year. So I got to the convention center around 10 o'clock. A little after 10. Once again, there was no line to get in. I already had my wristband, so I didn't need to check in or anything. Just need to display my wristband. I went downstairs to the show floor. I did some more bin diving and wandered around for a while. I wound up at a table where they were selling 2 comics for $1, and they had this huge collection that they had acquired recently. And so all of the comic books were bagged and boarded. They weren't all in order, but there was some semblance of order to it. So you would find like huge runs together. Although sometimes there were some comics series that would be all broken up. So you'd find a few issues in one box, a few issues in another box. It wasn't completely alphabetical or by publisher, but you would find some things. And they had obviously taken out some comics. Like, for instance, I found a run of Peter Parker, the Spectacular Spider-Man. And so I was thinking, well, I wonder if they still have issue 64 in there, which is the first appearance of Cloak and Dagger. No, it wasn't in there, but all the issues before it and all the issues, well, not all the issues before it, but a number of issues leading up to that and a huge run of issues after that were there. So obviously they'd pulled some issues out. Or somebody had. But from listening to the people who were running that table, and it was a pretty big table, or a pretty big stand, whatever you call it, space on the convention floor. Not the biggest, but it was pretty big. It sounded like they were taking books, they were sending people out with books to get them signed and maybe CGC graded, so I get the impression that they were the ones who had pulled out that particular comic and probably some others. But I did find some things in there to fill in some spots in my collection, as well as some things that I was just curious about and wanted to get. So, let's see. The first thing I found, which I was very happy to find, was Captain America number 264. This issue, I had a subscription to Captain America. This is the one that shows the X-Men in their blue and gold costumes. And it includes Jean Grey, and this was at a time just after Jean Grey had been killed in the Dark Phoenix saga. So it includes Jean Grey and Cyclops and Angel on the cover. So it looks like the original X-Men. And also Cap and the Falcon are on there. And this was early in the J.M. DeMatteis, Mike Zeck run on Captain America. And I believe J.M. DeMatteis' run went up through issue 300. There was a few issues in there that he didn't write, but for the most part, he wrote the issues from 261 to 300. I had a subscription to Captain America back then in the early 80s, and I got issue 263, which I think was the first issue in my subscription, but for some reason I never got 264. And then I got 265 through, I think, 276 or something like that. So I've been looking for this for a while. I passed on it once or twice in the past when it was like $2. So today I picked it up for 50 cents. It looks like it's in pretty good shape. So I was very happy to find that. Another thing to fill in a couple gaps in my collection were a couple issues of Young Heroes in Love. I picked up this series ran for I think 18 issues, and I picked up a bunch of them, most of them, on eBay several years ago. And the run that I picked up was only missing 4 issues. So these are 2 of the issues that I was missing, issues 11 and 17. And I'm still missing issue 2 and the 1 million issue. But I haven't read a lot of them. I did start reading it when I bought it, and I think I got 2, 3, 4 issues in before I dropped it. Of course, I didn't have issue 2, but now I'm a little closer to having a full run of that series. Another comic I bought from them was Avengers number 191. This is a comic, I picked this up for nostalgic reasons. I wasn't collecting Avengers at this point, but I was with my family back in the early 80s, and we were driving up to, I was a kid then, so this was probably 82, 83, something like that. Although I think this issue predates that year. Let me check and see while I'm talking. But because this was a 40-cent issue, my guess is this is from like 81 or 1980. And it's in the bag, and I don't feel like taking out the plastic at the moment, so I'm going to look it up on Comic Book DB instead. Let's see, number 191 is January of 1980. Okay. I'm pretty sure it was later than January of 1980 when we were on this trip, but I can't remember exactly what year it was. We may have been going up to visit my grandparents up in New Jersey, or we may have been going on a trip somewhere. But anyway, we had stopped at the Maryland House, which is a rest stop on I-95 between, I think it's north of Baltimore. Yes, I'm almost certain. Yes, it's north of Baltimore, but it's before 95 gets into Delaware and the Delaware Memorial Bridge. And there was a vending machine there that had comic books, and I got this out of that machine. I don't remember if I had the money or had to ask my parents for the money. I'm not sure. And I think this issue has a cliffhanger. And I think it might even be continued in an issue of Daredevil, because Daredevil shows up in this issue. In fact, I'm clicking through on this to see if there's any notes about this. No, there are no notes about this. But I definitely remember this cover because they were fighting the Grey Gargoyle. Anyway, moving along. So that's that's the Avengers. Another thing I picked up, let's see. Tell you what, Superman number 32. This is the 1987 series of Superman. I picked this up because this is the issue which I mentioned when I was talking about the episode of Dave Talks Comics. I'm going to look it up because I can't remember exactly which episode it was. Let's see, episode 85 of Dave Talks Comics. I was talking about For the Man Who Has Everything, which of course the villain in that was Mongol. And I had mentioned on that episode that I was looking for the comic book story, which was the origin, which was kind of the ancestor of the JLU story, not the JLU story For the Man Who Has Everything, but the War World JLU story. And I think this is the first post-Crisis on Infinite Earths appearance of Mongol. And I flipped through it already. It does not look anything like the War World story, but it's kind of the same idea. In this case, Superman he's off in space on this mission. He's been off on this mission for a while, and he ends up getting captured by Mongol and thrown in an arena to fight, and ends up getting into a fight with Mongol. And so I want to read it, and then I want to go back and watch the War World episode, which I know is much different because it includes Martian Manhunter and Green Lantern and Hawkgirl also wind up on War World. So I also picked up a couple other issues of Superman just based on the covers because I thought they looked cool. Number 18, which the title is Return to Krypton, this one is written by John Byrne. The other one, the Mongol one, was written by Roger Stern. And the art in number 18 is by Mike Mignola. And it's got a Mike Mignola cover as well, which I thought was very cool. So I picked that up. And from one place I looked online, it looks like it's the continuation of a bigger story. But then I also saw that it was reprinted in a collection without the previous issue, which was actually I think the previous installment was in Adventures of Superman. I can't remember the exact number, and I didn't write it down. So I guess I don't really need that previous issue to enjoy this one, I guess. And the other issue of Superman that I bought was number 20. Now this one is a cover, I think this is by Byrne, and it's guest starring the Doom Patrol, and that's why I picked it up. And maybe one of these days I'll read all of Byrne's run of the Doom Patrol. I think I have 2 issues of it. And it didn't last very long. I don't think it even hit 20 issues. Let's see, what else did I get? Okay, so the other things... Okay, so here's something I picked up. It's only 2/3 of this series. It's a series called Twilight, which was written by Howard Chaykin and drawn by Jose Luis Garcia Lopez, and Steve Olive, I believe, does the inks. It's a science fiction series. I really don't know much about it, but I ran across it at one point when I was doing a Google search or a search on on Comic Book DB, when I was clicking through on to see again, I was looking at what Howard Chaykin had done, and I saw this thing called Twilight, no relation to the vampire story Twilight. This was done in 1990, I believe, is when it came out, which of course would predate the Twilight story by over 10 years. Let's see, when did this come out? Twilight, yes, 1990. 1990. The first issue came out in December of 90, and then January 91, February 91. It's just 3 issues. These are prestige format. That's a big kind of square bound, 64-page issues. So, but I only found issues 2 and 3. They didn't have issue 1. So I still have some searching to do to get the rest of that story. And let's see, what else did I get? I ran across some issues of Superman Adventures. These were written by Scott McCloud, who of course is the author of Understanding Comics and Reinventing Comics, and at least one other volume which I have not read, but I have read both of those. Excellent books on comic books if you're interested in that at all. So I actually picked up just at first 3 issues, and then I went back and got another one, which just by chance I found out when I was looking online is actually, I picked up issue 3, which has a Brainiac story on it, which, as I understand it from Comic Book DB, was nominated for an Eisner for Best Single Issue. Didn't win, I guess, since it just says nominated. Issue 9, which is a Lex Luthor story, which Lex Luthor, Man of Tomorrow. And that sounded too good to pass up. And then I picked up issue 12, which looks like a Lois Lane story based on the cover. And then eventually I went back and picked up issue 11 because I needed one more comic because comics were 2 for $1. And I didn't realize it at the time, but I picked up issue 11. It actually looks like, from my research online, that 11 and 12 is a 2-part story. So I'm really glad that I picked up issue 11. And then the final issue I picked up from this 2 for $1 or 2 for $1 sale was The Flash number 161. And this is by, it's not by, interesting. Okay. It's not by Wade. Let me go back to Comic Book DB now and verify this. I'm just from looking at what the cover says. Wait a minute. I thought I added this. Okay. I guess I forgot to add this. Well, here we are. Title of this issue, it's not written by Mark Waid, even though it's smack in the middle of Mark Waid's run on The Flash. But it's an issue about Jay Garrick, not about Wally West. So this issue is it's the title of the issue is Honeymoon in Vegas, and it actually follows an issue by Mark Waid, which was Honeymoon on the Run or something like that, which I guess was about Wally and Linda, I think was his wife's name, their honeymoon. So you've got the Flash, Jay Garrick, and Jay and Joan. Yes, it's Joan is his wife. And there's also some members of the JSA in the background, Green Lantern, Wildcat, Hourman, Dr. Midnight, and the Atom. And so it's a one-off, and so I figured why not pick this up. I found a number of issues of The Flash from this time period, but they weren't all together. And actually, since buying this, I kind of got the idea that I want to go back and get all the issues that Paul Pelletier drew, because he did draw this one, and he was the regular artist at this point, although he only drew, I think, one more issue after this. So I'm kind of curious about those issues, and I'd like to buy the rest of them and read them. I think it's 145 to 160 and 162. So that's everything I got in that 2-for-1 sale, and I know I've been going on and on and on about this, but I really love these issues, and I'm looking forward to reading them. Oh, on the Captain America, there's now like 8 issues that I'm missing from the J.M. DeMatteis, Mike Zeck run from issue, and I don't think Zeck drew all of them, but from issue 261 to issue 301. Actually, I don't think DeMatteis wrote 301. I think 300 was the last one he did, but 301 is kind of, I think, an epilogue from what I understand. So, and I have that issue, but I'm missing 8 issues in that run of roughly about 40 issues, or maybe it's 41 issues. So that's something to look forward to, looking for in comic book bins in the future. So after that, the next thing I did, I was going to go to a panel, but I had about 15 minutes, and so I went over to the Hang Dai Studios table that I had stopped at. I think I mentioned that on Friday, and I chatted briefly with Dean Haspiel, who I'd also seen at the Small Press Expo, where I had bought Heart-Shaped Hole, which I read, and I finished this weekend, I think yesterday morning, which is very good. It's great stuff. It's definitely adult in that there's nudity in it, and it's kind of about relationship stuff, and it's not about sex, but sex definitely figures into the story, if you know what I mean. It's more about their relationship, Billy Dogma and Jane, although I don't think they ever give Jane a last name in that story, or I couldn't find one. But it's very good, and in some ways very poetic. I really like the way he draws, the way he uses words and pictures together. So I decided to pick up his latest, and I don't think he's put out a ton of stuff, or at least of his own stuff. He's done some stuff for Archie, I think. But so I bought his, I've got to pull this, well, I don't have to pull it out because I actually have this written down, but I bought Beef with Tomato, which is the name of his new book. It's, I guess, a graphic novel. And, yes, it's a graphic novel. And he said it's more autobiographical because the Heart-Shaped Hole has a lot of, like, supernatural and fantastic elements to it, although I kind of take that to be, that's part of why I said it was poetic, I guess, because he's getting very, kind of, what's the word? Not sublime, but, okay, maybe I'll think of the word. But it sounds like he's, in Heart-Shaped Hole, it sounds like he's talking about something very real, but he uses very unreal pictures to get to it or to talk about the story, kind of the way, when you visualize things sometimes in your life, you make them very epic. Okay, maybe you don't, but sometimes I do. And it's not always for the best, but but this, he said, is much more grounded, and it's much more about his life. So I'm looking forward to reading this. And Heart-Shaped Hole had color in it, but it was kind of like color washes for the most part. Yeah, I think it was color washes, whereas this is all just black and white, and I guess some gray tones. So I'm looking forward to reading this. I probably won't read this quite as soon as I read Heart-Shaped Hole, since I don't have any plans to go to any more conventions soon. So after that, I went to 3 panels in a row. I went to, and this was at about noon. I think the first one started at 12:15, and that was the 75th anniversary of the Spirit. Yeah, 75th anniversary of the Spirit panel. And this was done by Arlen Schumer, who was the same guy that did the Silver Age comic art panel. And I'll talk about that, this Spirit panel soon. The second panel I went to was Comic Books as Cultural Mirrors panel. And the third panel I went to was the Tom Palmer Spotlight panel. And so that, I was busy in those panels from basically noon until after 5 o'clock. No, wait, no, that's not possible, because the show closed at 5. Until after 4 o'clock, yes, until after 4 o'clock. So for about 4 hours. And part of that was because of technical difficulties, which I will talk about when I talk about those panels. So that was basically it. After the panels, I did go back down to the show floor. I still had not found New Teen Titans numbers 11 or 14. So I went back down. I wandered around. Things were obviously closing down because it was after 4 o'clock. The show was closing at 5. I stopped at some tables I'd been at before and looked through boxes I hadn't looked through. I stopped at some other tables. I was basically looking for boxes. I didn't want to pay more than $2 for these issues individually. So I avoided any boxes that were any more than that. I also avoided boxes that were obviously not organized, because there's some people who bring boxes of comic books that are completely disorganized. And I find that sometimes you will find some gems in those boxes. But it is a lot of work to go through those boxes. And especially at this point, it was near the end of the show. I didn't have the time to go through this stuff. So I bounced around and I finally found issue 14. And the funny thing was, when I found it, the box I found it in, they had about 7 or 8 copies of it. So it cost me $1. They unfortunately did not have issue 11. So that is still on my list of comics on my back issue bin search list. So that was the last thing I bought. I thought about going and buying Arlen Schumer's book on the Silver Age of comic book art, but I did not. So that was it. So I just basically, I walked back to my car. There had been a Ravens game, the football game that day, which ended around 4 o'clock. So there was all kinds of people walking around in Ravens gear, heading back to their cars and maybe to parties as well, or to pubs or bars. So I walked back to my car, drove back home. Actually, I made a stop on the way home because in writing out my notes for this, and I like to keep notes. I have a notebook, and I basically finished filling up my notebook. Well, I had 1 page left in my notebook after I made my notes after day 2. So I stopped at Staples on the way home. Well, it was a bit out of my way, but on the way home. And I bought another notebook, and actually a bigger notebook, and I will start using that when I start making my notes about these panels that I went to today. And so that's what I'm going to talk about next. I'm going to talk about the 3 panels that I went to, and in varying degrees of detail. So the 75th anniversary of the Spirit panel was moderated by Arlen Schumer, and it basically was a retrospective on the Spirit and Will Eisner. Like the Silver Age of comic book art panel that I went to on day 2, he had a visual presentation. He was talking throughout the presentation. He had the lights down, so I did not take any notes during the presentation. And the notes I have are just things that I wrote out after I got home. He talked a little bit about the original run of the Spirit, how it started as, well, how it was throughout its initial run, which was several years. It was an insert in the newspapers. I believe a 7-page insert. And it was originally in black and white, although most of the editions that you'll find today, unless it's an old reprint, are in color. And various people have colored it, and there have been various, some of these stories have been colored and recolored. And he didn't go into too much detail, but he did talk a little bit about, apparently, one of the first people to do the coloring for it when it was being reprinted by Warren Publishing back in the 70s was Richard Corbin. And he showed us some pictures of those, but those were the first times that I had seen those, or certainly been aware that Corbin was the one who had drawn those. I think I've read a little bit by Corbin in Heavy Metal years ago. I have a few issues of Heavy Metal still from years ago, but really I'm not extremely... I know of him, I don't really know him that well. Schumer also talked about Will Eisner's career, both as the creator of The Spirit and also his career in graphic novels, starting with A Contract with God, which was the first graphic novel he did, it's an excellent story. It's definitely worth seeking out. And he also talked about his work on PS, which was a magazine that he did. I'm not sure if magazine is the right word. It was a set of manuals, I believe, that he did for the armed forces, the U.S. Armed Forces, using cartoons, to inform soldiers. Probably, I don't know if these were just used by the Army, or if they were also used by other branches of the military. But Schumer actually showed us some images from this, and apparently there's a collection out there of these manuals, which I'm interested in getting. I am a big fan of Will Eisner, and maybe I'll talk about that a little more as I go through this. He talked about his first introduction to the series, which I believe, if I remember correctly, was the Jules Feiffer's book, The Great Comic Book Heroes, which I have a copy of around here somewhere, but I'm not sure exactly where it is, which basically was a book, I believe it came out in the 60s, and what Jules Feiffer did was he basically reprinted the origin stories of a lot of the characters, including the Spirit, from the golden age of comic books, and in between had essays about these characters, and I guess about comic books. I should really pull that out and read it. My own personal introduction to the Spirit was in a book that my parents bought for me and my brother, which was the Smithsonian Book of Comics. Now, this is actually available. I don't have it anymore, but you can actually find it very inexpensive on Amazon. There are lots of used copies floating around out there. Even a new copy, you can get a new copy for under $30. And it was a beautiful book, as I recall. It included all sorts of, it was mostly comic book stories, as I remember, from the Golden Age through maybe the Silver Age, possibly. I don't remember how far it went forward, but I definitely remember the Spirit story from there. It was the story about the guy who wanted to fly and discovered he could fly, and it has a tragic ending, but it's a very good story, and it's a beautifully told story, and I haven't read it in years. I actually only have one collection of The Spirit. I don't have any of the archive editions. I was eyeing a couple of them at the show today, but I don't have any archive editions. I have one, the Femme Fatales collection, which is very good, and of course I've also read Darwin Cook's 12-issue run on The Spirit. I have those two collections, which I thought he did to varying degrees of success. Some of the stories I really like, some of them kind of left me scratching my head. Now, Schumer did address the racist, stereotypical way that the Spirit's companion, Ebony White, is drawn, and by Will Eisner. Of course, when Cook updated the character, Ebony White got a completely different look. But even in the original book, Ebony White was a taxi driver. And Schumer felt very strongly that despite the way he looked, Eisner did what he could to give him a certain amount of, I think he said dignity. I'm positive he used the word dignity, but I think there was some adjective that he used in conjunction with the word dignity. But he felt that Eisner did not do wrong by the character, even though he drew him in a way that made him look like a stereotype of a black person or an African American, or as they said in that day, Negro. He also talked about how Eisner liked to lay out the title page, and he showed us several examples of that using paper. What I mean by using paper is that there would be bits of paper floating around that would spell out the word the spirit, or there was other things that sometimes it would be buildings that would spell out the word spirit. And if you've never seen any of these, you should look some of them up because they are really gorgeous. And it's really neat how he does that, and it's definitely been copied by plenty of artists over the years. Because basically what Eisner was doing was using the title of the book as he turned it into art on these title pages, and it's just gorgeous. It's just amazing, and the variety of things that he did with it. Although there were certain themes, buildings and bits of paper floating through the air, things like that he did. He just talked a lot about the way Eisner drew things and how artists who have come after, just about every artist who's come after Eisner has gotten something from Eisner, either directly or indirectly. And I personally love Eisner's work. His graphic novels are wonderful. I have not read all of them. I've read a number of them. I have a Contract with God, and let me see, what else do I have on my shelf if I can find them, although now that I've sorted everything by title, it's going to take me a little more to find them all. Well, City People Notebook, and I believe I have The Building around here somewhere, and I don't know if I've ever read A Life Force. I don't think I don't have that. Let's see, is there anything else on my shelf that I can spot that is by Will Eisner? I'm not seeing, I think those are, Invisible People. Name of the Game, I think, is another one that I've got. I think that's the most recent one that I've read. These are all old. These are not new. There's plenty more that I should be buying and reading. And about the panel, finally, I was really sad when it ended. I was really getting into it. I was really enjoying it, and the pictures and the words and the way. And Schumer is he's a very excellent presenter. He researches this stuff, and he does a great job presenting the stuff. And once again, if you want to just hear him, I would say go listen to the episodes of Word Balloon that he is on, because those are excellent. And his excitement for the medium, his excitement for comic books and art just comes across very clearly. And this was, like I said, it was a lot of fun, and I was really sad when the panel ended because I wanted there to be more. It had just flown by for me. At 1:30, I went to the Comic Books as Cultural Mirrors panel. This was hosted or moderated by Christy Blanche, and the other panelists were Mark Wade, Walt Simonson, and Louise Simonson. This wasn't exactly what I thought it was going to be. It wasn't an open conversation or a Q&A. I think I was expecting it to be something where the moderator would ask a question and then have each of the panelists respond to the question, or just kind of a back and forth open with the panelists asking each other questions and taking questions from the audience. Instead, and there were some questions from the audience at the end, but instead what it was framed through the moderator, Christy Blanche's slideshow or PowerPoint presentation on comics and popular culture in the United States, and kind of followed from the 1930s up to about the 1980s. I mean, more or less the present, but they didn't go into much detail the further along they got. And I think part of that was because they ran out of time. They really needed another half hour or more to really go through all of this history, and it was a little disappointing in that respect, but it was a good conversation. It was an interesting conversation about the way that comic books have reflected what is going on at the time and what is there in the popular culture at the time. So they started with the 1930s, and they talked about how Superman was a response. Superman and Batman were both responses to things that were being seen in pop culture. Superman, a response to the Depression and violence against Jews. Batman was a reaction to urban crime. Then they got into talking about Uncle Sam and Captain America and Wonder Woman and some other characters who were, patriotic superheroes who showed up. Well, they didn't all show up after the U.S. got into World War II, but they certainly showed up after World War II began. Because Captain America showed up, I believe, in 1941, but of course the U.S. didn't get into the war until December of 41, and I believe he showed up in the summer of 41, or maybe the spring. They talked a little bit about Superman. They showed an image, in fact, of Superman disguising himself as a Japanese man, and they talked about the rampant racism, and that's the words that they used, in comic books at that time. And I certainly won't disagree that there was plenty of racist caricatures and portrayals of people who weren't of Asian people and black people and other peoples who weren't white, basically, at that time. And it wasn't just during World War II. It continued for a while. And honestly, it's not that hard to believe that this would show up in comic books, because you were seeing kind of the same thing in movies, for instance, where you had a German actor, Peter Lorre, playing a Japanese person, Mr. Moto, and you had a Swedish actor, Warner Oland, playing Charlie Chan in the films. So it isn't that hard to believe that the same would be true of comic books. And comic books. So they went on through history and talked about a lot of different things. They talked about horror comic books and how comic books started to be aimed at teens, and this was in the period after World War II. Walt Simonson had this interesting theory about that the horror comics were all about turning the suburban dream into a nightmare, which makes me think, and he didn't specifically talk about this, but makes me think that he was referencing post-traumatic stress disorder, which is something that really isn't discussed when it comes to World War II veterans, but I think was certainly there, certainly existed. It's much more common to talk about it in relation to, I think, Korean War and Vietnam and other wars since World War II. They talked about the establishment of the Comics Code Authority and the impacts that had, and how early comic book heroes would fight, would actually go. I mean, there was actually issues where you have Iron Man fighting in Vietnam, and you have Thor fighting Chinese communist bad guys. There was an interesting it wasn't Walt, it was Mark Waid who talked about Galactus and Silver Surfer and how Galactus represented the younger generation, the older generation, and Silver Surfer could be interpreted as representing the younger generation. I mean, here he is riding on a surfboard, and Galactus is the guy who wants to destroy this world he's just come to, and the Silver Surfer is the guy who doesn't want to, who sees these people for what they are, a sentient race, and doesn't want to do this. And so that was an interesting, and this was, at this point we were talking about the 1960s, the comics of the 1960s. Walt talked about the importance of O'Neill and Adams, Denny O'Neill and Neil Adams' run on Green Lantern and Green Arrow, and talked about how that was a much better reflection of the younger generation than you got in a lot of the other comic books at the time. He was kind of really put out by, I don't know, he thought it was laughable the way that a lot of the older comic book writers depicted, writers and I guess also artists, depicted some of the younger people, hippies he specifically has cited, but I suppose he meant a lot of the younger people in comic books, and how they were always way behind the trends. And he said that, if you saw Marvel following a trend, it meant the trend had already peaked, and if DC was following a trend, the trend was over. It was already gone. Once they got into the 1970s, they talked a little bit about Wonder Woman and how Denny O'Neil took her powers away, and that lasted for a good run. That was from issues 178 to 203, so that's about 2.5 years, I believe. Let's see, that's what, 10, 25 issues? Yes, that's it's about 2 years, a little over 2 years. And it was kind of funny because there was some serious protest of that from Gloria Steinem when this happened, because she felt that Wonder Woman, was the one superhero that women had. But the panelists seemed to fixate on her clothes, on Wonder Woman's clothes during this period, and how she wore such great clothes. And I guess you could go either way on this, because she got maybe much more sensible clothes to wear, but at the same time they took away her superpowers. They talked about the drug issues from Green Lantern and Amazing Spider-Man. And this was in the early 70s. Both of these appeared in 1971. Both of these stories appeared in 1971. And how Marvel went ahead and did it without getting the Comics Code Authority on it. But they did it first, although they hadn't planned it first. But DC went to the lengths to work out a deal with the Comics Code Authority so that they could get the Comics Code Authority seal on the book, but at the same time, it took them so long to get that done, and at the same time still cover this whole drug issue in the book. And I guess, and there was a number of other things they discussed. They talked a little bit about the disco era and Dazzler. They talked about a little bit about the impact of Image Comics and how the way women were drawn in Image Comics and how that kind of changed things. And then they took a few questions from the audience. Probably the most interesting one was the person who asked about S.H.I.E.L.D. and how S.H.I.E.L.D. used to be the good guys. They used to be the heroes. And now they're seen as, well, the way I would describe it is shady at best. I can't remember the exact words that the person asking the question did. But, they're, and I mean, if you look at the way they're depicted in the movies, it's certainly that way. In the second Captain America film, where you have betrayal from within S.H.I.E.L.D. And Walt responded to that by saying that we used to believe in, I'm not quoting here, these are just my thoughts or my summary of what he said, that we used to believe in the incorruptibility of superheroes. But after Watergate, things started to change in the world, including heroes, and that the world, these institutions, these heroes were no longer incorruptible, that they can be corrupted. And this, of course, the mention of Watergate makes me think of, I think it's the Invisible Empire story in Captain America, which I actually have not read. It's somewhere in the mid to late 100s in Captain America, it's when Captain America, for the first time, stops being Captain America after Watergate. He's so disgusted with what happens that he stops wearing the Captain America uniform and for the first time adopts the uniform of the character named Nomad, who did come up in the comic book, the run of Captain America, where I started reading around issue 261. But that's another story for another time. So that was the comics as cultural mirrors panel, and there's a lot more to it, but that's my brief description of it. The final panel was the spotlight on Tom. The final panel that I went to was the spotlight on Tom Palmer. Actually, this was the last round of panels. The moderator for this was Jose Villarrubia, and Tom Palmer, of course, was there. Now, this panel, unfortunately, was not as good as I hoped it would be. It was interesting. It just wasn't quite what I hoped it would be. It started late, primarily because of technical problems. They put them in a room that was just way too big for this event, and so they were trying to rearrange things to hook things up in ways that they weren't set up to be hooked up, and so they had to do a lot of modifications, and each time they tried to turn it on, and the colors weren't right, and this wasn't right, and that wasn't right. And so the panel started about 10 minutes late, and then it ran for like another 15 minutes over. And the other thing was that they had a microphone, but even with the microphone, both of these guys spoke softly. And I was sitting in the front row. And I could hear them, but I couldn't hear them. They weren't loud at all. And I really wondered about people towards the back, if they could hear them, or how well they could hear them. But anyway, Jose chatted with Tom about his career. He showed lots of slides of Tom's work with various artists, a lot of them with Gene Colan. Tom Palmer started in advertising, and that's where he met Jack Kamen. And Jack Kamen was an EC artist who'd worked on a lot of horror and science fiction books for EC. But basically when EC folded in the mid-50s, he went into advertising, and he basically didn't go back to the world of comic books. They talked about Gene Colan, Tom's work with Gene Colan, and Gene Colan, many felt that Gene Colan was difficult to work with, to ink his work, his pencils. And Tom says he thinks this is because Gene penciled softly. If you've seen Gene Colan's pencils, they're beautiful. They're just gorgeous. I mean, they're unlike almost anybody else's pencils. But somebody else mentioned Gene Colan. Oh, I know who it was. I believe it was Bob McLeod from the New Mutants panel on Friday. Mentioned Gene and how he wasn't comfortable inking Gene Colan, but Tom Palmer was, and they showed a lot of collaborations between the two. Some of the books that they collaborated on were Doctor Strange and Daredevil and Tomb of Dracula. And in the case of Tomb of Dracula, almost the entire run. I think they said Tom wasn't the original inker on Tomb of Dracula, but he came in around issue 7 or something like that. And one interesting story that he told about Gene was that Gene got pictures, stills, from the Dracula film that starred Jack Palance, and would use these stills as reference when he was drawing Tomb of Dracula. Another thing about Tom is that he was very versatile. He was a penciler, he was an inker, he was a colorist, he was a painter. As a colorist, he was self-taught. He talked about how he didn't like the coloring job that was being done, and so he went and he talked to the editor, and he got some information, basically, and he basically taught himself how to color. And in some ways, they did kind of go into areas that I felt kind of lost, where some of the things he talked about, it got a little detailed or a little technical, let's put it that way. And I had no idea what they were talking about, or I was confused. The other artist that they talked a lot about him working with was Neil Adams. And he worked with Neil Adams most significantly on X-Men, and that's that run of X-Men for about, 8 or 9 issues, something like that, right before X-Men got canceled in around 1970. So the two of them worked together for a number of issues there. Those are classic issues. Those are great issues. Definitely worth seeking out. If you read nothing else from those early X-Men years, you should definitely read those. Definitely worth reading. And apparently Neil asked for Tom. And that's, they went on and on and on, and Jose had all kinds of slides to show and all kinds of things, and I wish this panel had been a little better structured. The last time I went to a panel that Jose Villarrubia moderated, I think was 2012. This was also at Baltimore Comic-Con. I think it was the Frank Quitely panel. I don't remember having the same technical problems there. But anyway, this was probably my least favorite panel of the convention. Well, not of the convention, but certainly of the day. It was not a bad panel. It was good to see some of his work. It was good to hear some of this information. It was interesting to hear him talk about these things, talk about his relationships with some of these other artists. And, so that was the Spotlight on Tom Palmer panel. Following up on a few things that I said earlier in this episode about Superman 32, which was the issue that features Mongol on the front. That issue is not Superman's first post-Crisis on Infinite Earths appearance. Now, I looked into this, and it's a little confusing, so I'm going to talk a little bit about Superman pre-Crisis and post-Crisis, because there are some issues that came out after the mini-series, or the maxi series, the 12-issue series known as Crisis on Infinite Earth ended, but before the last official Crisis, pre-Crisis on Infinite Earth Superman story. So, Crisis on Infinite Earths ended. The last issue is cover dated. Issue 12 is cover dated March 1986. But the last pre-Crisis Superman story is cover dated September of 86, and that is Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow, which is split up between Superman 423 Part 1 and Action Comics 583 Part 2, both cover dated September 1986. Then, over the next 3 months, there was the Man of Steel miniseries, 6 issues, I guess 1 issue every 2 weeks, which was done by John Byrne, which kind of reintroduced Superman. And then in January of 87, they relaunched Superman with, I guess they'd already relaunched him with the Man of Steel, but the Superman title became Adventures of Superman, or at least the numbering. So the first issue of Adventures of Superman was 424, picking up the numbering from Superman. And then there was a new comic book called Superman, which started with number 1. And there was also an Action Comics continued. And so the next issue of Action Comics was number 584. All of those were covered dated January of 87. I have 2 of them. I don't have the other one. I was buying some of these things back then. I also have the Man of Steel miniseries. It's one I really want to reread, and I wouldn't mind rereading some of these other early issues from the beginning of the reboot, or at least post-Crisis on Infinite Earth Superman. I guess it was a reboot of sorts. And there's similar history with Batman and Wonder Woman and some of the other characters, but I didn't do the research on those for right now. So, getting back to Mongol. Mongol appeared in some stories in 1986, but before the Superman reboot officially happened, before the end of the year, before the Man of Steel series. He appeared in DC Challenge and he appeared in DC Comics Presents, but I'm pretty sure those would be considered pre-Crisis on Infinite Earths or before the end of Crisis on Infinite Earths. So those would not count as the first post-Crisis on Infinite Earths appearance, even though they came out after the 12th issue of Crisis on Infinite Earths. So, although Superman number 32, which came out in 1989, it's not the first appearance, because 1 month before, see, this was when Superman stories were kind of spread out across the three Superman titles: Action, Adventures of Superman, and Superman. And so you get 3 issues a month, and the story would kind of go through all 3 of them. So it was just, and I don't know if they always did this. I wasn't following it very much. I bought the first few issues when they started in '87, but then later on I didn't stick with them for very long. And I think it was just lack of interest. I don't think the stories were that bad or anything. I just, other stuff going on in my life, or maybe I didn't have the money to spend on them. I'm not sure. So Mongol's first post-Crisis on Infinite Earths appearance is in Adventures of Superman number 454, which is dated May of '89. And then Superman number 32 is dated June of '89. And then he also appears in Adventures of Superman 455, also June of '89, and then he also appears in Action Comics Annual number 2, which I believe is also dated 1989. So, if I really want to get all those Mongol appearances from this story, because it's all part of one big story called, I think, Superman Exile, or Exiles, or Exiled, I should get all these issues, or I should get the trade that collects them all. But So that's my roundabout way of saying that I did not get the first post-Crisis on Infinite Earths appearance of Mongol. What I got was the first cover appearance, post-Crisis on Infinite Earths cover appearance of Mongol. The other thing worth pointing out is that I know that he appeared in these issues because it says so in the comic book database, comic book DB, but, sometimes it'll say they appeared in this issue and it's just a cameo. It's like a one-panel appearance or something like that. It's a flashback, and so you get... So, I'm not sure how important those appearances were, but I'm still kind of interested in picking up those issues. Okay, enough about Superman and Mongol. A couple other things, just quick little follow-ups. When I was talking about Heart-Shaped Hole by Dan Haspiel, I couldn't find the word, and I said sublime, but I said no, not sublime. I think the word I meant to use was surreal. His storytelling has a kind of surreal feel to it. That's it as far as things that I said. Now I just want to give some comments, some general comments about the show, because this is the final episode about the show. The Baltimore Comic-Con, is I find the triangular shape of that space confusing. It just, I would get to points where I thought I knew where I was, and I realized, I thought I was walking vertically, and I was actually walking horizontally, if you know what I mean, because there's a crisscross, there's horizontals and verticals as far as aisles, and I would think I would get all turned around. I'd wind up back somewhere in a different part of the floor than I thought I was at. And the section where all the indie people were was not a problem because that section was fairly rectangular. But the triangular section of that space confused me, which especially where the retailers were. So that's just me. And I think it confused me last year as well, which was the first year that they used this section of the convention center. Let's see. And then just some wrap up. I was there for 3 days. I spent a little under $200. I spent about $195, and that's for everything. I got 32 comics. Spent $30 for those. So I was rather picky about pricing. I didn't spend more than $2, and the least I spent was 50 cents for a comic book. I got one graphic novel, which cost me $15, and I got a T-shirt, which cost me $20. I got 2 Lego minifigs. Those were $10 altogether, $5 a piece. And there was the 3-day pass, there was parking, and there was food, and all that for under $200. So I think I did pretty good. I went to 9 panels, 3 a day. I recorded all of them, and I'm planning to post them all. And I have added a section under Dave Talks Comics, a page specifically for convention panels. I think I have about 9 of them posted as I'm recording this now. You can get to it by, really the only way you can get to it, unless you know the exact address, is on the main page. If you scroll down to the section where it says conventions, there's the words there that says panels I attended. Well, I added a link there. If you click on the words panels I attended, it will take you to the page where my recordings of these panels are posted. And these, of course, are just audio recordings, no video. I have 9 panels up there right now. I have plans to post all 9 that I recorded at Baltimore this year. So that'll make 18. And then I think I have another 13 from prior years, I believe, from 2012 and 2014. So, I don't know, that's over 30 panels, I'm pretty sure, once I get them all posted. And I'm not going to any more conventions until next year, so that'll be it for now. But I'm thinking I'll try and post one a week until I have them all posted. But probably not the same day as I post episodes, like probably 2 or 3 days after or before. Oh yeah, about the panels. I wanted to say, not all the panels were great, but there was at least one that I really loved each day. And even the ones that I would rate as my least favorite were still good, and they could have easily been improved if, by technical things. Usually it was the sound quality wasn't good, or they had it in fact, 2 of the 3 panels, or maybe all 3 of the panels that I went to in that really big room, really didn't need the big room. And the sound wasn't great there, and there was noise, a little bit of noise from the air conditioning system, and that, and then sometimes people wouldn't be close enough to the microphone, and so the microphone wasn't picking them up well enough, and so so I enjoyed all of the panels to varying degrees. Some of them were great, and I had a really great time. I honestly have to think, I've been to Baltimore Comic-Con 5 times in the last 6 years, and this is right up there. If this wasn't my favorite experience at Baltimore Comic-Con, it was certainly right up there, because I really felt like I got my money's worth, especially with the panels, with the stuff I bought. It was a lot of fun. And next year's con is much earlier in the month. It being this late in the month was actually unusual, because normally it's like early in September, and like 2010, 2011 was actually in late August. So this was unusual that it was this late in the month. So next year, it's September 2nd, 3rd, and 4th of 2016. So that's it. Unless I think of something else, maybe I'll record it and add it to this. But that's it for Baltimore Comic-Con 2015. That's it for episode 92 of Dave Talks Comics. Dave Talks Comics can be found on the web at davetalkscomics.com and facebook.com/DaveTalksComics. On Twitter, @DaveTalksComics. Email can be sent to davetalkscomics@gmail.com. Next time on Dave Talks Comics, I'll be talking about Knights of Sidonia, Season 1, the first 6 or so episodes. For real, I hope, this time. I'm Dave. Thank you for listening. When I was talking about back.